Uh, so we should start right now, okay? Begin.
Okay. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Andrey R. I hope you're doing well today. We have with us our returning host, Soviet Bear, and we're going to be discussing a number of topics, particularly particularly issues such as Islam and is Islam compatible with schools of thought such as Eurasianism and the alt-right and white nationalism, and yeah, I believe that's going to be the main thrust of the subject. How you doing today?
Yeah, I'm doing great. I'm doing fine. So, there is this personality in the Islamic scholar. His name is Sheikh Imran Hussein.
Mm-hmm.
And, I actually like that guy. And, his preachings are not not the same as other Muslim scholars. Especially he preaches about not just Russia, but the Eastern Orthodox branch of Christianity.
Yeah.
Well, and he says that Eastern Orthodox branch of Christianity will be allies with the Muslim world. Well, some of the Muslims and the Orthodox Christians would strongly disagree, but still, according to him, this is what's written in the Quran. So, if you're a Muslim, you shouldn't disagree with the Quran. But there are other scholars who interpret that those Christians, the Muslims will ally, are Western Christians, not Eastern Orthodox. However, and I'm not praising this sheikh just because he praises Russia. Well,
right.
He just recites the Quran and gives his perspective, and I like that perspective personally, as a Eurasianist and as a Russian and as a Putinist and as a anti-ISIS and anti-Islamist guy in general.
Mm-hmm.
So, Sheikh Imran Hussein, and I don't think there is actually another sheikh who preaches the same things as Imran Hussein does. So, and what is your take on this sheikh?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know much about him like on a personal level, but I mean, yeah, he's one of the examples. Another good example is the Kevin Barrett, who's actually a WASP American who converted to Islam about 20 years ago or so. He does really good work, and they're one of these they're these type of people that are, I mean, Islamic in their faith, but they're not unequivocally apologetic about anything any person or government does that is Islamic. Like they don't sort of give excuses for all things that are Islamic. And I think people like that often their devout faith is Islam, but they kind of see that often the like in an ideal world, maybe they would like the whole. They do think that Islam is the true faith, but realistically, you're not going to get people to convert to another religion unless by force. And even if you try to use force, it's not going to work. So I think at a certain point, realpolitik kicks in, and a lot of them have said seem to they have no problem explaining why they came to Islam, but the thing is that they understand that you're not going to convert people with a sword or a gun, and that the next best thing to do is often they put their energy towards real geopolitical issues like war and immigration, etc., and they don't sort of spend their whole time looking for Islamophobia in areas where it may or may not exist, and they're not like chastising people for any and all criticisms of Islam. Like I think that people like the sheikh you just mentioned, they're more they sort of realize that whether the Middle East likes it or not, it is part of Eurasia and does needs to figure out how to get along with many of its neighbors, even if they completely hate their neighbors. Like I think Alexander Dugin has mentioned that as much as you may not like Turkey or Israel, nonetheless they're not going away. So we need to figure out as best as possible to if not of a friendly, but at least a non-confrontational relationship with them. So the thing is, asking Turkey to stop supporting different branches of the anti-Assad coalition, and asking Israel to stop supporting, stop supporting mass immigration into Europe, and at the same time supporting the Banderites and the terrorists in Ukraine and Syria. Those are very reasonable demands to make. But I think that the idea of asking expecting Israel or Turkey to simply as a state not exist, I think is unrealistic. Even if you want to make the completely valid claim that it was founded on blood and conquest, but the fact is there's a lot of countries that were founded on illegitimate means. But the thing is that you know there's a lot of people there. There's a lot of people living, I mentioned Turkey and Israel, that have a complete are completely will not condone what their government does, and you can't ask them to give up their sense of statehood overnight just because of what their government does. Like, I think people that often will say, "Oh, what Israel does, Israel, the state of Israel in and of itself is illegitimate and should be dismantled." Like, well, how are you going to do that outside of force? You really can't. Yes, Palestinians should have their own state, which is why I believe in a two-state solution. But it's unrealistic to ask somebody, well, the whole state and your whole sense of being a country is illegitimate, so do you mind if the state were to break up? No one's going to say yes to that. Even if they concede that the state that they're living in was founded on blood and conquest.
Well, yeah, and there are actually Arab nationalists, that not Islamists, but secular Arab nationalists who still wish for revenge for the Arab-Israeli wars, and even Syrian girl partisan herself, the Syrian girl, and she tweeted many times that she doesn't recognize the creation, that she doesn't recognize Israel at all, and she advocates for basically wiping Israel off the map. Well, I don't think it's realistic. I mean, the, and my position here on the relations between Russia and Israel, because I am myself, but we will cover that later. But I am myself have some sort of distrust for Jews and especially for Zionists. So I don't think we should be. I don't think we should be in the confrontation with Israel, but we shouldn't get too close to it either. I mean,
Yeah.
our relations with Israel should be like nothing personal, just business or
Yeah.
something like that.
Well, yeah, exactly. And the thing is, I think what a lot of people forget, and I've actually been, gotten some criticism of it, is that I think a lot of people think that the confrontational nature that the Israeli government has as of right now is how it's always been, and that's actually not the case. Like, I'm not obviously going to defend everything the Israeli government's ever done, but it's not the case that it's always had this basically causing problems for almost everybody. It used to be for a while that the only people that had issue with Israel was the Palestinians. Understand? Basically, they kind of did. They didn't really make when I say they, the Israeli government, not the people. They didn't make themselves a nuisance to everyone else. So, for example, if Israel had race and religious laws, they wouldn't lecture the Christian world to not have some themselves. Like their attitude was almost like Israeli first. It's like, we're gonna do our thing, and as long as you don't bother us, we don't have any problem with you. Like for the longest time, during the Cold War, I'd say the first half of it, Israel had sort of a didn't really participate that much in the Cold War, and actually did have some, because the original founders of Israel were much more socialistic than they are now. They actually had some sympathy with the Soviet Union, but as a general rule, they kind of saw the Cold War as a war between two Gentile superpowers, and it doesn't really concern us. And that's part of the reason why you very rarely heard, other than let's say the 6 Day War or the Black September, big events like that, you didn't hear Israel and Palestine on a constant basis if you lived outside of like the Middle East, because they kept their own. It's a comparison would be like since I just came from there, Colombia's war with the FARC. That whoever you think is right or wrong, I'm not going to get into it here. But the point is, they kept their business sort of within the confines of their own neck of the woods. They didn't project. The Colombian government doesn't hunt people down to the ends of the earth that criticize their government and say, you're anti-Colombian, you hate mestizos, that's why you're criticizing the Colombian government. They don't have that sort of hypersensitivity to criticism that, to be frank about it, the Israeli government has. Like, nobody says you're anti-Colombian if you want to boycott the Colombian government, but for some reason it's anti-Semitic if you want to boycott from Israel. Like that, yeah.
Yeah, and nobody's gonna say you are anti-Russia, you are anti-Russian people if you want to boycott Putin or the Russian government. Nobody's gonna say you are anti-Russia or anti-Russian people. You are anti-government or anti-Putin. But when it comes to boycott Israel, you're anti-Semitic. You just hate all the Jews and yada yada.
Yeah. Well, actually, being anti-Russian actually is one of the few anti-Xerphobias you're like allowed to be.
Yeah, I believe we covered this in one of our videos, right? Like you cannot get away with hating Jews or LGBTQ or
Muslims,
Africa
yeah.
or Muslims or Africa, but with hating Russians you get away easy.
Yeah, well, not just that, but I always find this sort of a really bad sort of dark joke that I had, that these leftists and Democrats and internationalists, it's like they're so worried about hurting the feelings of minorities and people of color when they're in the West, but they don't seem to have any problem of bombing the shit out of their native countries abroad under the guise of liberating them. It's like, okay, if you feel like such a connection to these people and care so much about them, why don't you eliminate the reason why they came here to begin with? Like, I'm not saying that justifies mass immigration into Europe. Or to the West. I'm not saying that, but it is the case. Like, not every there are some cases where a refugee actually is a real refugee. Like, in that a lot of them, their homes were destroyed. Like the real Middle Eastern ones, you could make like not the ones from Africa, but the Middle East, you could make the case that a lot of them, they legitimately are refugees because they're from the instability of like Libya and Iraq. And it's funny how that Muslim countries, the same leftists and liberals who hue and cry about Islamophobia, but if a Muslim country seems to be not playing ball with the West, it seems to be aligned with Russia, then it's okay to like invade them or topple their government. I mean, where was the cry about Islamophobia when like Qaddafi was like dragged in front of the street by terrorists? And like, I mean, I've heard some horrible stories about how he was killed, that he was fucking anally raped with a bottle and just crazy
with a
shit
knife.
with a
With a
knife.
knife.
Yeah, it's like, where's your concern? Like, that doesn't bother Western liberals, right? But oh my God, you criticize the Quran in a Western country. That's the thing they're going to be upset about. Oh, but to topple a government and to like just like publicly rape with a knife and kill their leader. Oh, that's fine. Oh my God, but don't hurt their feelings though. Like, it's such a ridiculous like inconsistency. Like, I mean, if foreign policy was up to you or me, they would say, look, what you do in your own neck of the woods is your own business. Just don't cause any problems for us, and then we're good.
Well, yeah, and you see, those powers are those Democrats and the leftist, the liberal wing of American government, and well, they're so selectively concerned about the human rights of Chechen Muslims or Bosnian Muslims.
Yeah.
But but when it comes to like Libyans or Iraqis or Afghanis, they seem to just don't give a shit about it. Well, yeah, it's like you say, because they are generally not aligned with the West, and their governments are not aligned with the West, but because like Chechens are there, Chechen rebels, Chechen jihadis fighting against Russia, and the Bosnians and Albanians, Kosovars are fighting against Serbia, who are then that's just absolutely fine to support them and be concerned and be so concerned about their human rights.
Yeah. Well, I mean, human rights in quotation marks. I mean, if a lot of these opposition groups to either Russian or Serbian or even for that matter Chinese rule were so grassroots and authentic, why are they getting like supported by the West and its allies, these opposition groups? And it's funny, a lot of them are actually led by people that are not even living in, like, they're part of the diaspora. That they're part of the diaspora. Like, it's so funny when I see a lot of these so-called genuine opposition groups, and their leaders, they speak better English than like their native speakers, and just because they may have been born like they're like they may be ethnically Albanian Muslim or Bosnian Muslim or whatever, but it's like they spent their whole life in like fucking the US or Canada. Same as with these Ukrainians, and like they but because their parents were born there, somehow that gives them the authentication of being, oh, we're the true opposition, da da da. It's like, then why don't you go actually live there? It's like a lot of them, they were like, a lot of these opposition groups, the leaders were like appointed by the West to be, oh well, yeah, you never stepped foot in Kosovo, but your parents are from there and you can speak a bit of the language. You're the sincere opposition leader. Or you get even I've noticed too, even with the even with the Chechen situation, some of the so-called the separatist opposition, if you look at a lot of, you can tell they're not even Chechen. They're like mujahideen from like other parts of the Middle East that kind of they see it as like, they see it more as a holy crusade, as a jihad, as opposed to, they don't actually, thing is, if they actually gave a shit about Chechens, then they would understand that being under Kadyrov's rule, and sort of by an extension that under Putin's rule, their standard of living has actually gone up a lot better. So if they actually cared about the well-being of the people they say they claim to care about, then they wouldn't want to be separatists. Like a lot of these guys, I don't know if you've noticed this, but the Mujahideen will often go from conflict to conflict, and once Kosovo is separated or Bosnia is separated, then they'll just jump to another fighting another secular or pro Eurasianist aligned government. So like a lot of these same people that are fighting in Syria now we're fighting in Libya, we're fighting the Soviet army in the Soviet
In
Afghan
Afghanistan.
war, and then fighting the Serbians in Bosnia. Like they jump from, because the thing is, then they never actually have to deal with the consequences of what they've done and the instability that they cause. So they're sort of like they're mercenaries for hire. Like if you're so committed to the cause, why don't you go live in the country that you fought so hard for? If you're so sincere, well, they don't have to live with the negative consequences of their actions. Like a lot of the I've noticed a lot of the volunteers that are fighting for the junta or fighting for the Neo-Banderites. A lot of them are not even fucking. They're not even Ukrainian them. They're not even Ukrainian themselves. A lot of them are Muslims that are just vaguely anti-Russian for whatever reason, or they're sort of dyed-in-the-wool anti-communist.
Or
And,
die in the wall Russophobes,
or Russo,
like
yeah,
yeah, like I actually heard there were a lot of volunteers fighting in Donbass, like even from Finland, even from Sweden, from Poland, and from other parts of Europe. But mainly those people who fought on the Ukrainian side in the Donbass war, the foreigners, they were just either dying the wall anti-communist or just dying the wall like Russophobes. And I heard from one of the Donetsk People's Republic militia commanders that there was actually the entire Georgian battalion. I mean, from Georgia, from the state of the state of Georgia in the Caucasus, not from
right.
the U.S., but from yeah. And he said that the entire Georgian battalion was fighting against the Donetsk militia.
Right. Well, what I find interesting though is that if you look at the quality of people that, I mean, there's a great phrase that says, there's a great phrase that says, let me know who your friends are, and that will sort of indicate how you are. If you notice too, like even on the Ukraine, the TV show Ukraine Today, which is a completely Kiev propaganda outlet, but what I find interesting, even when they try to look bad, quote unquote, the volunteers for Novorossiya, I mean, I've even posted some of their videos because it's like they're just they try to make them sound like, oh, they're neo-Nazi, neo-communist, neo-something, whatever. But you look at them when they talk, they're just fucking normal people that have volunteered for Novorossiya, and it to me it sort of says something that you know the quality of people between the two conflicts. It's like you try to demonize that volunteers for Novorossiya, but they're a lot better quality of human being, like that than you get on the other side. Like it seems like the junta and the Banderite side, the quality of people they get is like basically people that they know that their jihad they know that their jihad and Neo-Banderism wouldn't fly in their native countries, so they go to an area that's kind of unstable right now just so they can fight. I mean, they see Novorossiyas as just Russians, that like, and it's an illegitimate cause. That's the only reason why they're there. They don't actually give a shit about you about Novorossiya or Ukraine. That's the only reason why they're there. And you'll get these fucking like you get these people that they'll parade themselves as being, oh, we're freedom fighters from Chechnya and Syria because we don't want to deal with the oppression of Putin and Assad. It's like, no, you know what? Your jihad wasn't tolerated in your country, and you know that, and you can't go back or else you'll face jail time. Um, that's the reason why you're heading back. You're heading here because you know that your terrorism is not going to be apologized for like it is in the West. Like it's funny though how when there's a refuge, when people are need asylum from like from a Eurasia or a Eurasianist aligned country, is that there's no criminals. They're all political dissidents. All of them is completely innocent. All they have to say is, well, we're dissidents against Putin or Qaddafi or Assad, and then boom, their legitimacy is automatically just because they don't like their government. Well, most of the time, it's funny. A lot of these same people that are so-called so-called dissidents are the ones actually promoting a caliphate in the West, and that like a lot of the same people. Like it's funny. A lot of the initially I noticed a lot of Polish nationalists used to sort of think that, well, maybe we should let Chechens in because they're anti-Russia like us, and maybe we can have common cause with them. But now they're causing a lot of problems in Poland, and now they're sort of thinking, well, just because somebody is like the enemy of my enemy is not automatically my friend.
Yeah, absolutely, and I agree, because you see, well, you see, Saudi Arabia and Israel, they both may not like Iran.
Yeah.
They don't like Iran both, but that doesn't mean that Saudi Arabia and Israel hate each other. I mean, well, like each other. I mean, for not the government but the people. I mean,
Right.
if you ask an average Israeli about Saudi Arabia, he would most likely say, "Oh, it's so like Islamists and backward, and I hate it." And if you ask average Saudi citizens about Israel, he would probably say that, "Oh, Israel is a infidel, Jewish state. It doesn't belong
Right.
in the Middle East," and blah blah blah. Well, you see, an enemy of my enemy is not always my friend. You see, ISIS are against the West, and they say that they are against the West, and they wage jihad against the West. But still, just because ISIS are against the West, it doesn't mean Russia should ally and aid ISIS.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, well, the thing is too is that a lot of times the people, the opinion of the people is not necessarily the same as the, like, on a personal level, Israelis and Saudis. If you could just pick the average person, just
Yeah.
the normal person, yeah, they probably don't. But their governments have a their governments have a vested interest because they have a lot of the same enemies. In fact, this was actually mentioned, believe it or not, in the mainstream movie Charlie Wilson's War, which is a complete, piece about, oh, the Mujahideen. Like, they never call the Mujahideen by that name in that movie, funny enough, like Tom Hanks. It's always like freedom fighters, right? I mean, what? Well, as long as you're anti-communist, you can justify like anything, right? So it's funny when they show Tom Hanks trying to get Israel and Saudi Arabia to support the Mujahideen, freedom fighters, quote unquote, in the Soviet-Afghan war. They kind of, on a personal level, the Israeli ambassador and Saudi ambassador were sort of like giving each other like the sort of the crooked eye, but they kind of realized that their anti-Sovietism and their sort of Cold Warism override the fact that on a personal level they may not like each other. And that always overrode the their personal dislike of each other often will get override by their both desire to have dominance in the region, and also too that they both want to be on good standing with with the West. Like
Yeah,
that's just one thing I've noticed. Like even um yeah, I mean, for God's sakes, I mean, there's footage now of like the so-called Syrian rebels, the FSA, getting treated in Israeli hospitals. Like, I mean, it's not even a conspiracy theory. Like, I mean, there's footage of it being shown. Like, so I don't understand where the realm of like doubt is. Um, and from what and so I forget what your initial question was, but I mean the it's not like if people I think geopolitics explains things a lot more than whether than a conspiracy or what people does or does not want to believe. Like it doesn't matter what you do or do not want to believe. Like geopolitics tends to override whatever ideological problems. Like for example, here's a perfect example. Iran Iran today, as far as I know, they've outlawed and put into exile the Communist Party of Iran, but they don't have a problem with having good relations with China. Or I know Hugo Chavez is dead, but his government still runs Venezuela because they view it as like, look, they're communist and they're infidel, but frankly, that's all the way in South America. What problem are they going to cause for us? Nothing. So there's no reason to be hostile to Venezuela, even though ideologically speaking and religiously speaking, yes, they're communists and they're infidels. But frankly, what is Venezuela gonna attack Iran? They have trouble
yeah.
feeding themselves. They're not gonna like become a menace.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And you see, if we're speaking about Islam and Islamophobia, well, many people on the right and on the alt right and
Yeah,
white nationalists, they say that Islamophobia doesn't exist. Well, I have to disagree on that. When due to the latest events and the terrorism and the immigrant waves into Europe, yeah, Islamophobia does exist. Well, is it just, or is it not justified? Is this, we can also cover that, but I think it's a different subject. So yeah. So what is your take on Islamophobia?
well, the thing is I often don't like the way that it's phrased, as in Islamophobia versus Islamophilia, because that sort of implies that all Muslims and all interpretations of Islam are, like, in quotation marks, the same, and they're not. And I'm not saying this to be politically correct. I'm just saying this as an empirical fact. They're not all the same. That's like saying
Yeah,
because uh, because George Bush and the Republican Party self-identify as being Christian, a hardcore Christian. Oh, then I guess I'm justified to hating all Christians. Or Benjamin Netanyahu, is obviously Jewish, so all Jewish people must be X. Like it's like, here's the thing: people on the right that I identify with, they don't like it when you paint with a broad brush Christianity. So you
yeah,
kind of need to be consistent. You have to be the same with Judaism or Islam.
or
Like, for
Islam.
example,
Yeah,
I would vote if I was living in Russia. I would vote someone like Ramzi Kadyrov, pronouncing his name correctly, Ramzi
Ramzan.
Kadyrov, yeah, the head of Chechnya, much more than my own prime minister. Watch, I'm gonna get a call from internal securities now. And or somebody like Zhirinovsky, who I
Yes,
heard his
yes,
background is Jewish, but frankly, so what? I mean, like at the end of the day, I mean, they both self-identify as like being loyal to Russia. They're totally against the Atlanticist powers, and
yeah,
if 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 someone's religion if someone's religion if somebody that's non-Christian, if the worst thing they do, in quotation marks worst thing, is go to a something else that's not a church, frankly, that doesn't particularly bother me. Like my main issue with Islam is that it tends to be that we don't even take in the ones that you could argue we should take in. We tend to take in all the worst of the worst. Like, because if you actually look at Turkey or Chechnya or some of these Middle Eastern countries, not everyone there is like a welfare abusing, self entitled piece of crap. Because obviously, if
yeah,
everyone was like that, society couldn't run. Like every
yeah,
society, you need
absolutely.
to have people working, being productive. If everyone was on welfare or on the dole, to use a British term, then the societies couldn't run. So I think what happens is that they know that that sort of self-entitled behavior is not acceptable in their own cultures, so they go to the West where they know it is going to be acceptable. Like, I mean,
Yeah,
why? Here's the thing: the people that are prosperous, why is it that they don't come? Why is it that they don't leave Iran or leave Syria or leave whatever? Well, it's because why would you leave? It's your home. You've got yourself together. There's no reason for you to leave. But unfortunately, in the West, um, we take in the worst of the worst, like the lower levels of people. And I think that unfortunately it creates an impression, particularly if um, you're not as politically you're not as politically savvy as you or I, and you don't have natural and inquisitive nature. That if the only Here's the thing: if the only Muslims you ever know about are the ones causing problems in major West European cities, I can't lie and say I sort of understand why you would have that impression. It's kind of like, on a similar level, a lot of people on the alt right, or people on the right in general in the United States, when they think of a Mexican or a Latin American, they get often they're referring to the illegals that are the bottom feeders and the lower levels in their own
yeah,
society, and they know that they can come to the United States and live off the system. So then, unfortunately, they have this impression that everybody that lives in the New World south of the U.S. border is an absolute like welfare piece of crap. Well, if that was the case, then how does Latin America sustain themselves at all? Like, obviously,
yeah,
not everyone can be like that. So the thing is, I think that often, it's easy to get tunnel vision if the only encounter you've had with group X or religion Y is this sort of behavior. then um, then I sort of see why you can sort of get this negative impression. But the thing is, that's very tunnel vision. That's very tunnel vision. Like, it's not. Here's the thing: it's not Latin America's fault. It's not the Middle East's fault that the West takes in their worst of their worst. It's our government's fault for taking them in. I don't care who, like, if if my government takes in the worst of the worst from the second and third world, I'm not gonna. Why would I be mad at the second or third world? It's like, look, if I kick somebody out of my house who's a welfare abusing crackhead, and he lives with you, it's like it's not my fault. It's your fault for taking them in, as an
yeah,
example.
yeah, well, absolutely. And those European governments who taken the worst, the low life, the bottom feeders from
Yeah,
from the Middle East. It's just people understand what the ordinary people understand, that basically their governments are committing suicide by letting all of those in.
Yeah.
But but the problem is with the people themselves. Many people in the West are becoming, well, I think the word cocked is overused. Let's just call it ethnomasochism.
Yeah. Well, not just that, but the thing is, though, I kind of think that in some ways is that, look, if you vote on a certain policy, that and then and if you vote on a certain policy, like I kind of think that being brainwashed is kind of like, it's almost overused in the sense that it almost creates an excuse for why people have stupid ideas in their head. Like, okay, yeah, I grant you that I'm not denying the brainwashing happens, but I mean, like, come on, think for yourself. Like, I was from believe it or not, most of my family are completely your standard liberal-minded Canadian that votes for Trudeau, but I just sort of used my own brain that's in my head and figured out, yeah, a lot of the official narratives in Canada are just crap and not true. So I've grown up in Ontario, like Trudeau land, literally. So there's no reason why I should have the views that I have. I just can think for my own, and frankly, I think I don't understand other people's excuses for just being sheeple, quite honestly. I actually think that people have more of an excuse that live in a country where you don't have elections. You have more of I don't want to say the word excuse, but you know what I mean. There's more of justification for, if you don't have any influence on what your government does, then you can say, I think reasonably, you can kind of, in a way, you have more justified reason to complain because you have no influence over what the government does. But I mean, people in the West, it's just I think that a big influence may be that a lot of people, even people that think of themselves as being so open-minded, such a strong independent person, quote unquote, that they can't deal with social ostracism. Like, they can't deal with, like, well, I kind of don't believe in these liberal narratives, but if I speak out against it, then people aren't going to like me, and God forbid somebody not liking you. Oh, that's just horrible. For a lot of people, I hate to be an asshole here, but I think women are more inclined to let social ostracism bother them. And to be quite honest, like, I'm not saying that to be a dick. I'm just saying it as an empirical fact where, I think that it's a lot easier to just give in to, not just give in to what everyone else thinks and rationalize why it's correct. Like, well, like, you rationalize why what everyone thinks is correct, even if you know in your heart of hearts it's not, because, well, I can't be alienated from my friends. I can't be alienated from my coworkers and stuff. Like, for me, the only real reason for keeping your mouth shut I can understand is at work, just because you can't afford to get fired. Like, that to me is like a reasonable explanation of why, if you're worried it's going to threaten your job, I kind of understand why people would sort of keep their mouth closed about certain things. But you know closed about certain things. But other than that, it's just like, I don't know. I find it really weak about how I find it really weak about how people can, they're they're willing to abandon what they believe under the just because of social pressure. Like, to me, that's really weak, quite honestly. I mean, and the thing is, I think that people, like, other than Germany, because of, obviously the artificial guilt that Germany has, I think that a lot in the West, particularly in North America, they have a lot more freedom than I think than they realize they have. Like, yeah, there are extreme scenarios when people are really, like, careless about, they advertise about how much guns they have, or there's picture after picture with, like, a Nazi flag or something, or if they talk about Holocaust revisionism nonstop and that's all they ever talk about, then yes, there are cases like that where the government has come and censored people, and I'm obviously can't defend that. But I mean, like, a lot of times I kind of feel that, use your head a little bit. Like, don't put where you work or even um where exactly you live. Just, like, use your head. I mean, don't, like, just, you know it, I don't know. I think there's a lot more free speech than often people think that there is in North America. Like I think listening to too much of, you know, the globalists are shutting down free speech, or the Zionists are shutting down free speech. Like, yeah, that does happen, but it's not like a government is all powerful and can, like, you know, see every nook and cranny over everything. Like, I mean, yeah,
Yeah, well, you see, I want to tell you about some curious case. Um, a German guy in the YouTube comment section under the Russian national anthem. Well, he's a Russophobic guy, and he was saying that, oh, Germany should rule Poland and Russia and make those lazy people, lazy savages, make them work and make their countries better, blah blah blah. And then another Russian guy, he said that, what are you talking about? You have migrants raping your women, and
yeah,
how can you say about this something about returning? Yeah, but basically, and the German guy responded, well, yeah, it's because Russia is so poor and shitty country, so nobody wants to go there, and that's why immigrants prefer civilized Europe. But dude,
yeah.
you're just being ridiculous. What the fuck?
Yeah, it that really, I mean, it's almost, and I almost wonder too if it's a way of sort of distracting. Like, I've noticed too that often, you know, countries or groups of people, in a way to kind of, they don't want to deal with their own problems because they're so, like, embarrassing, that it's almost like then they get concerned with these other sort of issues that are almost like, you know, it sort of reminds me of, like, you know, black groups, you know, making a big deal about these Confederate monuments and then making a big deal about tearing them down, or, you know, North American Indian groups, you know, getting mad about seeing Christopher Columbus, or stuff like that. And it's almost like, you know, do your communities, do they so have their shit together and their ducks lined up that the only thing you have left to complain about is these monuments, whatever you may think of them? I'm not even going to get into that, but like a statue, like how is a statue affecting your life? Like, yeah, maybe you don't like it, but I mean, like, honestly, like, what, it's almost a way of kind of not dealing with the real issue and sort of projecting outward, like, oh well, this is affecting our community. It's like, what does the drug abuse and welfare dependency and broken families, how is that caused by statues of, like, Christopher Columbus or a Confederate monument, or, like, even, like, fucking, you get in Ukraine and in Poland, people tearing down Soviet statues. It's like,
Yeah,
do you really not have anything else to do other than, like, we're worried about these statues? Like, yeah, there's some statues in Canada that I don't like, but I don't, you know, I mean, there's statues to Churchill and Trudeau, Trudeau Senior, that is, that I don't particularly like. But frankly, you know, there's a lot bigger things in Canada that I think are a problem than a fucking statue. Like, it's a statue. It's just whatever. I mean, it's almost a way of distracting. Like, it's almost a way of, if you criticize something European, or even particularly something Russian, it's almost like a safe target because you know you're not gonna get any pushback. But if you start criticizing if you start criticizing immigration in general, or the Islamification of Europe, that will get some pushback. Or addressing the dysfunctionality in some of the minority communities in North America, particularly American Indians and blacks, that will get you pushback. So it's almost like a lot of these people that don't want to deal with this sort of uncomfortableness in their own countries or their own communities, so they jump on, like, safe issues.
yeah. Well, you see, and speaking about monuments, you know, there is this guy on YouTube, that YouTube channel called Black Pigeon Speaks.
Yeah, I've
Well,
heard of him. Yeah,
he does great anti-SJW, anti-feminist videos.
yeah,
And once he said in one of his latest video, where he was praising Poland, and he said that the Germany is, you know, is takes care of the Soviet World War II monuments, and he basically explained it that, oh, because these bad evil Soviets raped them, and basically he says that Germans are so cocked, so they just they take care of the monuments of the people who raped and conquered them, and and he basically said that. And but come on, dude, be consistent for once. Well,
yeah,
Allied troops like the UK and the US also raped German women, and the Allied British bombers, they just pounded German cities like Dresden. They didn't left brick on brick on these German cities. So I think it's also, if you're being consistent, the Germans should also remove not just Soviet but all the UK and the US monuments. And he would have made, the Black Pigeon would have made a fair point if the Soviet Union invaded Germany first. But excuse me, it was the Germans who invaded the Soviet Union in the first place, and it was the Germans who committed as bad, if not worse, atrocities and rapes than the Red Army committed back in Germany. Even if it was a blowback, it was a revenge for what the Nazis did in the Soviet Union in the first place. I was basically offended by this video, by these double standards, and unsubscribed from the Black Pigeon channel.
Yeah. Well, the thing is though, like, to be really blunt about it, there's this term that I sort of want to get coined. It's called like selective humanitarianism, where it's like, look, in war, whether you're the whether you're the winner or the loser, all soldiers, commit atrocities and injustices. Like, and if you want to split hairs about which one was worse than the other, like whatever. But the point is that war is war, and the thing is that certain countries after a conflict, they're very selective about which atrocities or alleged atrocities they're going to highlight and which ones there's not. So it's funny though, now there's sort of been almost a move with a lot of World War II movies where it's like, for the longest time, when it used to be for a while that it was only the Germans that did anything wrong, and now it's sort of become like, oh, the Germans and the Russians, and the Russians were a little worse with what they did. But I mean, they hardly ever talk about what the Anglo-American forces did. So the thing is, the reason why I say selective humanitarianism is because you're choosing which victims are important to you, which ones aren't. So the victims on the Dresden bombing, they don't really matter because it was done by I forget if it's the British or Americans, or maybe
the British,
right.
The British.
But the alleged rape by Soviet soldiers. But by the way, it's funny how it always gets made into the Russians, as opposed to, it was the rapes that did happen were by the more Oriental and East Asian wing of the Soviet soldiers, and a lot of the Great Russian or Slavic soldiers really didn't like them. Like, there's this real sort of animosity between, like, most of the Slavic or Great Russian soldiers were just normal soldiers. Most of the ones that were the assholes were the ones from like Mongolia and the more like Asian ones that committed any crimes. But the point being is, like, where is why is there no guilt on Japan? Japan was an Axis power. Like, Japan, you can defend imperial Japan, and you don't get some sort of hate crime or Holocaust denial. Like, there's monuments to the Japanese Imperial Army from World War II, and were they not just as bad as the Germans? Like, it's like, why is that never mentioned? So the thing is that I'm always skeptical about whenever somebody wants to bring up, oh, truth and reconciliation about injustices, because number one, there's almost entirely a motive behind it about why they're doing this. It's always sort of, it's more often not a shame tactic about it's becoming more of a sort of sense of entitlement of, well, my people suffered an injustices, therefore we deserve so-called reparations. And that's just a toxic mentality to have. Like, and it's toxic for anybody, and I include white people in this. I'm not making excuses for anybody, but part of the thing that initially got me interested in Eurasianism, or sort of Russian nationalism, I'm using that term very broadly, was that it doesn't have a victim mentality. Like, I've never heard of a Russian patriot say, oh, well, because of World War II, Germany owes us reparations. It's like, if all these people and all these grievance industries, if they focused more their energy on preventing future conflicts, than they are about obsessing over past conflicts. Like, it seems like conflicts that are already over are more important than conflicts that are happening now.
Well, yeah, and that's wrong. I mean, conflicts, what happened decades ago, people really should get over it and stop this fucking stupid bullshit grievance mongering. I say these words because there is nothing more I hate in modern politics than grievance mongering, especially from countries like Eastern, like the Baltics and and Poland and Hungary and Czech Republic. Like, oh,
Yeah.
the Baltics said, oh, 7 decades ago, the Soviets occupied our countries. Therefore, modern Russia owes us reparations. I said, no, fuck your grievance mongers. Fuck your grievance
Well,
mongering.
it's actually, which is actually funny now, because a lot of the people making the claim are, like, the grandchildren. Like, they're born and raised in, like, the prosperity of North America, and yet somehow it's like, okay, how is this alleged injustice that you want reparations for? It's like, what difference would that have had on your life? You were born and raised in North America. Like, it's interesting to me that it seems like the children and grandchildren, and in some cases now great grandchildren, it seems like they only get this sort of sense of grievance mongering when they're born and raised in North America, particularly Canada and the US, where they're told that they're entitled. Like, it's interesting. When I was at the 100th anniversary of the Armenian genocide in Ottawa, it's funny, the people that grew up in Soviet Armenia, that were actually, like, literally there, they didn't have this sort of, like, their main issue was with Turkey, but they didn't have any sort of grievance against with Russia. But all of their, like, children that were born here, that sort of have been sort of brainwashed in the Canadian school system, all of them had this sort of, like, oh, not just Turkey, but also Russia owes us reparations. It's like, but you were born here. Your parent that you're here with, they lived in Soviet Armenia, and they don't have a sense of fucking grievance. They're just grateful to be here. Why do you feel that you have this sense of grievance? And then, and then I'm thinking to myself, you can't tell a country that, like, you can't tell a country that you demand reparations from them, and then wonder why they don't want to acknowledge your genocide. I mean,
Yeah.
I just noticed it's not just with Armenians, but it's a pattern that happens repeatedly. The second you go through the Canadian and U.S. school system, where you're taught about grievance culture. And it's funny, when I was in Colombia and I taught English speakers. I taught Colombians English. It's funny, even when I was talking to some of them that were obviously not white, that they were either mestizo or, like, pure, American, North American Indian, or I guess technically South American Indian. They didn't have this sense of grievance. They didn't have this sense of, oh, the Spanish colonialized us and we're entitled from colonialism. And so because of it, they were just, like, normal people. Like, they were just normal, just going to work, doing their thing. They didn't have this sense of, like, um, they didn't have this, like, sense of entitlement. And I actually think that having an entitlement culture, it poisons everybody, not just if you're white or non-white, or Christian or non-Christian. It poisons everyone, because then if you feel that you're entitled, then often it leads to, like, laziness. Then you feel like, well, why should I work? I'm entitled. I shouldn't have to work because of whatever.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And you see, the Baltic nations, the Baltic countries, they basically, all of their industry has gone to shit, and they are losing the important transit routes from the seaport.
Yeah.
So they basically don't have that many ways of making money. So of course they're trying to gild some money from Russia for
Yeah.
alleged occupation, but
Yeah.
the true reason is that they want to make some money, and they want to be Russophobic and just fucking. And Russia gets and Russia says very clearly and gets them and says, if you want to make business with Russia, then lay off your Russophobic policy.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Well, yeah, exactly. And the thing is, though, is that you know, if you don't want if you don't want people to give you grief about putting up monuments to the pro-Nazi, anti-Soviet collaborators in your country, okay, fine, but then you can't give other countries grief because they're putting up monuments to soldiers and armies that you don't particularly like. It's like, just fucking put up monuments to whoever the fuck you want, whoever the hell you want, and if, you know, foreign countries or foreigners visiting don't like it, then just, you know, whatever, they don't like it, it's not the end of the world. Like, I don't expect everyone in the world to have a unified narrative about history and who were the victims and who were the aggressors or whatever. Like, I mean, one thing I kind of dislike about Canada is that there seems to be uniform opinion about uniform opinion about who are the good guys and who are the aggressors. And then as soon as you start to challenge that, people throw accusations at you. I mean, I think sort of a healthy skepticism about all wars is healthy, but, you know, people shouldn't be raped over the coals just because they have a different point of view about who was the aggressor, who was the victim. Like, I personally don't care. I mean, you know, I don't personally care if there's like a monument to the you know, like the overstated Holodomor or Holocaust. Like, I mean, whatever, okay, it's there. Me destroying it or throwing shit at it, it's not going to change anyone's mind. If anything, all it's going to do is say, oh, look, there's so much anti-Semitism or Ukrainophobia or some other phobia happening. Look how intolerant, you know, people, Russians or white people are or whatever. It's like, just, you know, like here's the thing. You shouldn't have to resort to violence if you're so certain about your point of view. You should be able to just be able to debate and have a conversation. You know, yeah.
Well, yeah, you should, absolutely. And I am getting more and more, over time, I'm getting more and more like skeptical about all these genocides. Like, I mean, the genocides that are being used by politicians and political activists to
Yeah.
guilt trip or grievance mongering, like Holodomor, the Holocaust, and, well,
Slavery,
not
yeah.
slavery. Well, I'm not as skeptical about Armenian genocide. Well, I don't know. Well, Armenians. Well, so what is your? Can you be skeptical about Armenian genocide or not?
Well, you know, I mean, I think that, well, here's the thing is that as far as I know, um, like, I am skeptical about it because I think it does get used. The only thing is that Armenians don't have such a, like, they don't make such a nuisance out of themselves with regarding to if
Yeah,
people don't agree with their genocide. So that makes me personally a little more sympathetic, because, like, as I've never heard, I could be, anyone who's watching can correct me on this, I've never heard of an Armenian lobby organization saying, if you deny the Armenian genocide or revise the story, you should be thrown in jail. Like, I've seen protests against the Turkish government about, acknowledge the genocide, you know, this is a double standard in Canada, why do you throw people, like, I think it's a fair point to say, why is it that in the West you go to jail if you, I think other than United States, everywhere else in the West, if you deny the Holocaust or challenge it, you get arrested. Or in Eastern Europe, if you deny or rethink the Holodomor, you get arrested. But you can criticize, you can deny the Armenian genocide, nothing happened to you. I think that's a fair observation to make. But my point is, nobody should be thrown in jail for having a contrary view of history. And the thing is that Armenians, I mean, at least today anyway, I'm not an expert on Armenian history. Like, I know there was some acts of terrorism before they got their own, like, state, but now that they have one, I think they seem to, Armenian groups seem to have relaxed a lot more. And they don't put it this way: if you deny the Armenian genocide, you're you're not going to be physically attacked. Your life's not going to be destroyed. You're not going to be branded as being a neo Young Turk or whatever. Like, you're not going to be branded as some horrible thing. Yeah, you might get protested, but your life's not going to be in ruin. You know,
yeah,
they're not like a lot of these Banderite or Zionist or Black Lives Matter or SJW groups that will, like, if not physically attack you, just completely destroy you reputationally. So I guess on that level, I'm a little more sympathetic because, look, the Armenian community tends to believe that we're so certain of the genocide that the evidence speaks for itself. We don't need laws that deny your freedom of speech. So that to me says that they're a little more confident in their position because they're not asking for prohibition. They just want Turkey to sort of acknowledge it. But at the same time, though, I've started to notice there's a trend of some like Armenians that are against Eurasianism, because that would mean implicitly in Eurasianism about Eurasianism about the idea that the idea that you would have to come to terms with Turkey, and that whether you like it or not, Turkey is a major power. Like I've seen some people that are for recognition of the Armenian genocide that are against Eurasianism, because they basically don't think that reconciliation with Turkey can happen until they acknowledge the Armenian genocide. And the thing is, though, is that as awful as it sounds, it's not worth alienating Turkey just because they haven't acknowledged the Armenian genocide yet. I know that's going to sound pretty harsh to an Armenian's ears, but let's be honest, it was a genocide that happened 100 years ago. Like, why do you, like, it's almost at a certain point, what difference would it make if Turkey acknowledged it or not? Like, virtually everyone is, I think, I've met one person that was, like, over 100 years old that was there, but that was, like, as a child, but frankly, anyone that would have been affected by it is dead, so it's kind of like, it's more of a historical, excuse me, it's more of a historical issue than whether or not it has any repercussions today. It's sort of like if tomorrow the Union was the victor in the American Civil War, if tomorrow it was acknowledged that the Union if Lincoln had not been assassinated, that he was planning to deport blacks to Africa, and that the Union Army did dislocate a lot of American Indians. It's not like, okay, let's say the U.S. government did acknowledge that by the Union Army. Okay, that's great, you acknowledge that, but like, now what? I mean, like, what really difference would it have sort of made? That conflict ended 150 years ago or whenever it was. So it's sort of like, I think sometimes, frankly, people need to let shit go, and like, okay, you know what? You're mad about your atrocity not being acknowledged, but frankly, at the end of the day, it's like, what difference is it actually going to make? Like, I mean, you should be more mad at Turkey for supporting ISIS and supporting the so-called Free Syrian Army in Syria. That's something you should be pissed off about Turkey for, not about they haven't acknowledged a genocide that happened 100 years ago. But for some reason in the West, it's more like, it's so warped. It's more important to get an apology about an injustice that happened 100 years ago or 70 years ago. Oh, but justice that are happening now, oh, those take priority. Those take a backseat to crimes that happened, 50 years ago or 100 years ago or 70 years ago. Like, that's so warped. It's like, don't worry about genocides that are happening now, because that doesn't matter. Worry about ones that have already been long over.
Yeah, absolutely. And you see,
yeah.
And you see, it's not worth to alienate Turkey, and the same can be said by Israel. Now, I'm not a pro-Zionist. I'm not like Judophile or something like that. And in fact, Russia always has a historical share of anti-Semitism, and in the 19th century there were anti-Jewish pogroms in the Russian Empire. And you see, I am myself I'm not saying I hate the Jews. No, I don't. I don't say we should go full. I don't share this Hitlerian hatred for the National Socialist hatred for the Jews. I don't advocate for rounding them up and killing them. I just have some sort of distrust especially for the Zionists and for those who are Israeli firsters. Like, I'm afraid that they will put the interest of Israel above the interests of Russia, even if they are like pro-Russian Zionists like Avigdor Askin or Yakov Kedmy.
So, I've never heard of the second name. Say it again.
Yakov Kedmy.
Okay.
Well, he's also an Israeli, like former officer of the some sort of intelligence service there.
Yeah.
Well, not Mossad. I forgot how this service was called. Anyway, well, he was a frequent guest on the Russian TV, and he is pretty pro-Russian, but he's still an Israeli. He's still pro-Zionist. So yeah, he may speak pro-Russian, but I don't know what he has in mind, and that's what my distrust with the. Because I suspect Jewish, especially pro-Zionist Jews, pro-Israel Jews, of disloyalty. Will they put Israel above Russia, or they will not?
Well, yeah, exactly. And the thing is that the thing is though, it's fine to have a sense of connection to your ancestral land, or maybe not even your ancestral land, but some land that you have a religious connection with. But when push comes to shove, it's like your loyalty needs to be towards. It's funny how you have to walk on eggshells when you're asking somebody about their loyalty. Are you loyal to like? Are you loyal to like asking a Jewish person? Where does your loyalty come first if there was a conflict? Like, where you live here or Israel? Or asking a Muslim person, if there was a war, where's your loyalty, to here or to the Muslim country you came from? But it's funny, people don't seem to have a problem if someone was a Russian immigrant to the West and he was found to being like secretly on the payroll of the SSB and spying for them, nobody would have a problem of accusing them of disloyalty. But for some reason, when it comes to, to be really blunt about it, minority communities, then all of a sudden you have to walk on eggshells and like sort of phrase the question like, well, I don't want to be thought as being racist. It's like, at the end of the day, your loyalty needs to be towards one country, and if you're not loyal to that country, then maybe you shouldn't live there. And I think it's fine. And I think it's fine if you feel that, my loyalty really is to my ancestral country. I'm going to move there. Fine. There's at least a level of honesty. Like I knew one guy who was Jewish, and he didn't hate Canada, but he just felt more of a connection with Israel, and said he was going to move there. I'm like, okay, there's a level. I respect the honesty more than the sort of, people that try to say, well, I'm loyal to both, and sort of dance around the question about which one they're more loyal to first, and sort of try to change the subject about, well, that's just an anti-Semitic argument. Why are you asking me this? I prefer this straight up honesty as opposed to, the people that would sort of dance around the question. But yeah, the thing is, the idea that you can't be, the idea that you're automatically going to be accused of disloyalty. There are, for example, like in Russia, it's not like if you're Muslim or Jewish, you can't practice your religion and still be a Russian patriot. But the thing is though, is that you almost somewhat you can't blame why people might have an eyebrow of suspicion about you. Because Muslims and Jews do have a tendency, not all of them obviously, but to having a sense of dual loyalty. Like nobody. When if there's Venezuelan or Latin American refugees, nobody wonders if they're going to be secretly spying for their home country, because there's just not a tendency for that to have happened. But in certain communities, particularly with a strong religious sentiment, there has been that sort of feeling. So the thing is, if you don't want there to be accusations of dual loyalty, then okay, fine. Then accusations of dual loyalty, then okay, fine. Then don't give reason for there to be any. You know what I mean? Like then prove the stereotypes wrong. Getting mad and throwing accusations of anti-Semitism or Islamophobia,
or Islamophobia,
or Judeophobia, you're not, the way you get rid of a stereotype is to prove it wrong. The way you have a stereotype, is not to attack people that say like, well, where is your loyalty? Is it to here or is it to somewhere else? You're not going to change their mind by saying, oh, well, the only reason you're asking this question to me is because you're a bigot. I'm not even going to dignify that with a response. I'm like, so you're not answering the question, which is even more suspicious.
Yeah, excuse me, 1 minute, okay?